Many Black Gen X men grew up believing self-sacrifice was the only respectable way to move through the world, so setting a boundary or saying no could feel like a betrayal of everyone who raised them. This video follows one man's arc from constant giving and quiet exhaustion toward releasing that inherited guilt. It traces how a survival strategy born from real economic hardship became an identity, what it cost him physically and relationally, and what finally allowed him to choose his own peace without apologizing for it. The jar on Terrence Whitfield's counter doesn't hold change. It holds names. Torn corners of receipt paper, folded twice, dropped in by people who owe him something he'll never collect. Ms. Odom's television, Deacon Price's box fan, his cousin Rodney's rent 4 times now. Terrence is 55 years old, and the faucet in his own kitchen has been dripping since March. He can rewire a dead microwave in 11 minutes, but he hasn't called a plumber for his own sink in 5 months. His phone buzzes on the counter, a neighbor asking if he can swing by real quick, and his hand is already reaching for his keys before his brain finishes reading the message. Some Black Gen X men spent decades feeling guilty for choosing themselves. Terrence didn't feel guilty about it. He didn't think about it at all, because the thought never had room to land. This is the story of how a man built his whole identity around being needed, and what it finally took for him to sit still. Whitfield Repair sits on the east side of Youngstown, Ohio, a narrow storefront squeezed between a nail salon and a church that changed names 3 times in 20 years. The sign out front still says radios, small appliances, TVs, even though nobody has brought Terrence a radio to fix since 2011. Inside, the shelves are lined with other people's broken things, waiting for a man who treats a stripped screw like a personal insult. There are small habits about Terrence that tell you more than any conversation would. He always sits with his back to the wall in a restaurant, a habit he picked up from his father and never questioned. He folds his cash in half, then in half again, a tight little square he tucks in his front pocket instead of a wallet, the same way men used to carry money when a wallet could get lifted out of a back pocket in a crowded mill line. When something in his own house breaks, he doesn't call anyone. He just adds it to a mental list that somehow never gets to the top. At night, after the shop closes, he plays old soul records low enough that Denise can barely hear them through the wall, the one stretch of the day nobody is allowed to interrupt. He keeps his father's old toolbox in the garage, dented and rust-spotted, and refuses to replace a single tool inside it even though half of them are outdated. Terrence has been married to Denise for 26 years, and they have one daughter, Jordan, who is 24 and lives 2 hours south in Columbus. Denise works as a school nurse, patching up scraped knees and second-guessing the same instinct that keeps landing on other people's needs before her own. For most of their marriage, Denise assumed Terrence's constant giving was simply generosity, the kind of thing you admire in a man and don't examine too closely. It took her years to notice the pattern underneath the kindness. Terrence never says no to a neighbor. He said no to their honeymoon trip to Gatlinburg the week his uncle's transmission went out, and Denise let it go because that's what you did. He said no to a fishing trip with his old army buddy because a widow 3 streets over needed her air conditioner running before a heat wave. Nobody in the neighborhood would call Terrence selfish, not once, not ever. That's exactly the part that used to bother Denise the most. Ms. Odom is 81 and calls Terrence baby, no matter how many times he corrects her. When her television lost sound 2 winters ago, Terrence drove over in a snowstorm that had already closed 2 highway ramps. He didn't charge her, the same way he's never charged any of the widows on his street, and the same way he rarely charges anyone who reminds him of the people who raised him. Half the older folks on his street are still convinced Terrence can fix anything with a plug on it, which has led to some deeply confusing house calls over the years. More than once he's shown up expecting a broken microwave, and instead found somebody's grandson trying to get him to troubleshoot a smart thermostat, as if 1985 and 2026 run on the same wiring. Terrence usually figures it out anyway, mostly out of stubbornness, then spends the drive home wondering when exactly he became the neighborhood's unofficial help desk for everything electronic. His cousin Rodney calls when the rent is short, which is often, and Terrence transfers the money before Rodney finishes explaining why. Denise once asked him when was the last time he did something purely because he wanted to, with no one else's crisis attached to it. Terrence laughed and said he couldn't remember, like it was a funny question instead of a warning. None of this makes Terrence unusual inside his own family system, which is part of why nobody around him ever flagged it as a problem. The anthropologist Carol Stack spent years documenting how black families in communities facing economic hardship built dense networks of mutual aid, sharing money, childcare, and labor across households to survive conditions no single family could weather alone. Those networks were, and still are, a genuine source of strength, the reason entire blocks of people made it through recessions that should have broken them. But inside a system built on everyone giving what they can, the person with the most reliable skills and the steadiest income tends to get asked the most, and rarely gets asked how he's holding up in return. Terrence became that person in his extended family before he turned 30, and nobody, including Terrence, ever revisited the arrangement. To understand why a grown man treats his own needs like an afterthought, you have to go back to a Monday in September 1977, when Terrence was 6 years old. His father, Otis Whitfield, worked at the Campbell Works, the Youngstown sheet and tube mill that had employed steelworkers in that valley for generations. On September 19th of that year, a date the whole region still calls Black Monday, the company shut the mill's doors and put 5,000 men out of work in a single afternoon. Within 5 years, the Manning Valley lost tens of thousands of jobs, and entire blocks of Terrence's neighborhood emptied out as families moved wherever the next paycheck was. Otis's own parents had come north from Alabama during the later years of the Great Migration, chasing the same steel mill wages that had pulled hundreds of thousands of black families out of the rural South and into cities like Youngstown, Pittsburgh, and Detroit. For Otis, the mill wasn't just a paycheck. It was the reason his family had a house at all, the reason his own father hadn't died a sharecropper the way his grandfather had. Losing that job didn't just cost Otis income. It threatened to unravel a story his whole family had been building for 2 generations. That's the weight Terrence, at 6 years old, could feel in the kitchen, even though nobody explained a word of it to him directly. Otis Whitfield came home that week and didn't say much, which was its own kind of announcement in a house where he usually had something to say about everything. 6-year-old Terrence remembers his father sitting at the kitchen table with the classifieds spread out, circling nothing, just staring at the columns like they might rearrange themselves. Within a month, Otis had turned the garage into a repair bench, fixing neighbors' washing machines and busted furnaces for whatever cash or trade they could offer. It wasn't really about the money, not entirely. It was about a man who had just learned, in the most brutal way possible, that being replaceable could end your whole life without warning. Terrence spent his childhood handing his father wrenches and watching him become the man everyone on the block called first. He watched his father's shoulders relax every single time someone knocked on the door needing something only Otis could fix. Nobody sat little Terrence down and explained the lesson out loud, because it didn't need explaining. He absorbed it the way kids absorb everything that matters, through repetition, through watching what made the adults around him exhale. Being needed meant being safe. Being useful meant you couldn't be the one they let go. Terrence carried that lesson through high school, where teachers remembered him as the kid who'd stay after class to help set up chairs without being asked. He carried it into the Army at 19, where he became the guy in his unit who could fix anything with a battery or a bolt, and where being useful again meant being protected, this time by the men beside him instead of a foreman. He carried it into his marriage, into fatherhood, and eventually into the shop that still bears his name on a sign nobody reads anymore. Now think about what that pattern actually costs a body over 30 years. There's a body of research from the epidemiologist Sherman James, developed at Duke University in the 1980s, describing something he called John Henryism, named for the folk legend of a steel-driving man who beat a machine and then died from the effort. James found that black men who relied on prolonged, high-effort coping to push through repeated social and economic stress carried a measurably higher risk of hypertension, especially when that effort wasn't matched by the resources or opportunities to actually get ahead. In plain terms, the strategy that helped a man survive scarcity can quietly wear down the same heart that carried him through it. Public health researchers have documented for decades that hypertension runs unusually high among Black American adults, a pattern that can't be explained by biology alone and has everything to do with decades of accumulated stress. Terrence's doctor mentioned his blood pressure at his last 2 checkups, both times in the same gentle, half-joking tone doctors use when they're actually worried. Terrence nodded both times, made a note to watch his sodium, and then went home and fixed a neighbor's garbage disposal before dinner. There's a separate piece of the puzzle that shows up in research from the American Psychological Association on how boys are socialized into narrow definitions of masculinity, emphasizing toughness, self-reliance, and emotional restraint over asking for help. For a Black boy growing up in a collapsing steel town, that general cultural script got reinforced by something even sharper: the very real knowledge that vulnerability could cost you your job, your safety, or your family's stability. Terrence never learned to ask for anything, because asking implied a weakness the neighborhood couldn't always afford to indulge. He learned instead to give constantly, because giving let him control the one thing that felt controllable. That's a strength. Resourcefulness like that built entire households through recessions, layoffs, and neighborhoods hollowed out by factories that never came back. But strength and cost tend to live in the same room. The same hyperindependence that made Terrence reliable made it almost physically difficult for him to accept help, even from Denise, even when he clearly needed it. Humor works the same way in Terrence's life. He's the guy at every gathering with a joke about somebody's car or somebody's cooking, the kind of laughter that makes a room feel lighter. That humor also gives him an exit ramp every time a conversation gets close to how he's actually doing. Denise learned a long time ago that "I'm good" from Terrence usually means the opposite, delivered with a smile specifically designed to end the question. Emotional control works the same double-edged way. Terrence has never once raised his voice at Denise in 26 years of marriage, something she used to describe to her sisters like it was a small miracle. That same steadiness let him stay calm during 2 layoffs at the plant where he worked before opening his own shop, calm enough to keep the household running while other men his age fell apart. But steadiness that never cracks in public rarely has anywhere honest to go in private, and Denise has spent years wondering what Terrence actually does with his own fear, since he clearly isn't handing it to her. The answer, most nights, is that he takes it out to the garage and hands it to somebody else's broken lawnmower instead. In March of this year, Terrence's oldest friend, Marcus Doyle, everybody still calls him Man from a nickname that started in middle school, died of a heart attack at 54. Man collapsed in his own driveway, wrench still in hand, fixing a neighbor's transmission on a Saturday he'd promised his wife he'd finally take off. He'd been telling people for years that he'd slow down once things settled, the same sentence Terrence had been saying to Denise since roughly 2003. At the funeral, 3 different men stood up and described Man exactly the way people would describe Terrence: always available, never asked for anything, the first name anybody called. Terrence sat in the second pew and felt something shift that he couldn't yet name. Man's wife, Sherry, stood up near the end of the service and said something Terrence couldn't shake for weeks afterward. She said her husband had spent so many years making sure everybody else's world kept running that he never quite got around to asking whether his own was allowed to. A few pews back, somebody's teenager whispered to his mother, asking why the church was so full for a man who wasn't even famous or nothing. His mother told him to hush, but Terrence found himself wanting to answer the boy honestly. Man was the kind of famous that never makes the news, the guy every block has at least one of, until suddenly it doesn't. Driving home from the funeral, Terrence caught himself doing the math on how many Saturdays he had left if he kept living the exact same way Man had. He didn't like the number he landed on, so he stopped doing the math and turned the radio up instead, which was its own small piece of evidence for everything Denise had been trying to tell him. Here is where the story changes. For years, Terrence assumed his constant giving was simply generosity, a clean and uncomplicated inheritance from a good man, his father. The harder truth is that it was never only generosity. It was also a 6-year-old solution to a problem that never technically ended. How do you make sure the people in charge never decide you're the one they can live without? That question didn't stop being relevant when Otis got laid off in 1977. It just moved into Terrence's body and stayed there, dressed up as kindness so well that even Terrence couldn't tell the difference most days. Both things are true at once. Terrence really does love the people he shows up for, and Terrence has also spent 5 decades terrified of finding out what happens if he stops. That's the contradiction underneath a man who looks endlessly generous but is quietly running from something. There's a second insight hiding right behind the first one, and it's easy to miss if you only focus on Terrence's fear. The same 6-year-old who learned that usefulness meant safety also learned, from watching his father, that usefulness could be a form of dignity in a world determined to strip it away. Otis Whitfield never got a severance package, never got a public thank you for 20 years at the mill, and never got the chance to retire on his own terms. What he got instead, in that garage full of borrowed tools, was proof that he still mattered to somebody, on his own terms, in a system that had just told him otherwise. Terrence inherited that dignity right alongside the fear, tangled together so tightly that pulling one thread without the other was never going to be simple. Understanding that didn't erase what the pattern was costing him. It just meant Terrence could finally stop treating himself like a man with a character flaw, and start treating himself like a man who'd been running a very old, very reasonable survival strategy, long after the emergency had technically ended. Solitude tells a similar story in Terrence's life, just from the other direction. The one place he lets himself fully rest is his workbench, alone, with a busted amplifier or a dead lawnmower in front of him. For a man who gives himself away to everyone else all day, that workbench is the only room in his life where nobody needs anything from him yet. The strength in that solitude is real. It's where Terrence recharges, thinks clearly, and remembers who he is underneath the obligations. The cost is that it's the only place he allows himself to exist without earning it first. Denise noticed the leaking faucet before Terrence would admit it was a metaphor for anything. One night in April, she stood in the kitchen doorway and asked him, flat out, why he'd fix a stranger's furnace in a snowstorm before he'd fix the sink 2 feet from where they eat dinner. Terrence didn't have an answer, not a real one, just something about being busy that neither of them believed. Denise told him she wasn't angry, which somehow landed harder than if she had been. She said she was tired of being lower on his list than people who wouldn't remember his name in 5 years. That sentence sat in the kitchen with them for a long time after she left the room. Terrence stayed at the table another 20 minutes, replaying every version of the last decade, where Denise had quietly moved herself down the list so he wouldn't have to notice. He thought about her missed lunch breaks covering for him at the shop during tax season, and the birthday dinner she'd rescheduled twice because a customer's freezer couldn't wait. He'd never once asked her to do any of that out loud, and that was exactly the problem. Jordan came home 2 weeks later for what was supposed to be a normal Sunday dinner, and she brought a boundary with her that neither of her parents expected. Terrence asked her, almost automatically, if she'd host Thanksgiving this year since her apartment had more room than anyone else's, even though it clearly didn't. Jordan said no simply, without an apology attached, and explained that she wanted to actually enjoy the holiday instead of managing it. Terrence felt an old, familiar irritation rise in his chest, the same flash of judgment his own father might have aimed at a young person who didn't understand sacrifice. But he watched his daughter say no, and then keep eating her food like nothing dangerous had happened. Nobody stopped loving her. Nobody called her selfish behind her back, at least not that she'd ever hear about. The sky, as far as Terrence could tell, did not fall. That single dinner planted something that took a few more months to fully grow. Move forward to July, when Terrence finally went in for the checkup Denise had been asking about since Man's funeral. His doctor read his blood pressure twice, the second time slower, and used the word concerning instead of the usual gentle joke. She didn't lecture him about sodium this time. She asked him a simple question instead. What does an average Tuesday actually look like for you? Terrence started listing favors, jobs, and other people's emergencies, and heard himself doing it, maybe for the first time. His doctor didn't interrupt him, just let him keep talking until the list ran out on its own. When he finally stopped, she asked one more question. In that whole list, where exactly was he? Terrence opened his mouth to answer and realized, honestly, that he didn't have one ready. That silence told both of them everything the blood pressure cuff already had. He left that appointment and sat in his truck in the parking lot for 11 minutes before he could make himself drive home. That sounds small until you understand what it was doing. For the first time since he was 6 years old, Terrence let himself consider that being needed and being safe were not actually the same thing. The following Saturday, Ms. Odom called about her garbage disposal, and Terrence, for the first time in longer than he could remember, told her it would have to wait until Monday. He said it kindly, and he meant it kindly, but his stomach still turned over like he'd done something wrong. Ms. Odom said, "All right, baby," and hung up, completely unbothered, already planning to just use the sink strainer until then. Nothing collapsed. No one accused him of changing. The only person in the room who seemed shaken by that phone call was Terrence himself. A week later, Rodney called about the rent again, and Terrence, hands shaking slightly, said he could cover half this time, not all of it. Rodney was quiet for a second, then said, "Okay, cool, I got the rest," in a tone that suggested he'd had a backup plan the entire time. That detail alone told Terrence something uncomfortable about how many of his sacrifices had never actually been necessary in the first place. Some of what he'd given away over the years had been rescue. Some of it, he was starting to realize, had simply been performance for an audience of one anxious 6-year-old who still lived somewhere inside him. Now connect those two things, the fear that built his usefulness and the guilt that punished him for ever putting it down. They were never separate problems. They were the same problem wearing two different faces. On a Sunday morning in August, Terrence walked past the leaking faucet on his way to make coffee, the same way he had for 5 months. He stopped, looked at it, and for once didn't have anywhere else he needed to be. It took him 40 minutes and a trip to the hardware store 2 blocks over, the kind of repair he could have done blindfolded on someone else's house years ago. When the drip finally stopped, Terrence stood there in his own kitchen and felt something closer to grief than pride. He thought about all the small, ordinary versions of himself he could have taken care of over 3 decades and simply hadn't. Denise came downstairs, saw the dry sink, and didn't say anything dramatic. She just squeezed his shoulder on her way to the coffee pot, which somehow said everything the moment needed. That fall, Terrence started leaving the shop at 5 on Wednesdays no matter what was still on the bench, and driving out to the reservoir with a fishing rod he hadn't touched since before Jordan was born. He didn't announce it as a lifestyle change or post about it anywhere. He just started doing it, quietly, the same way he'd once quietly built a life around never doing it. Jordan noticed before he ever mentioned it, since a photo of a decent-sized catfish showed up in the family group chat one Wednesday evening in October. She sent back 3 exclamation points and nothing else, which from a 24-year-old counts as an enthusiastic standing ovation. Denise didn't say much either, but she started leaving Wednesdays open on the calendar hanging in the kitchen, right next to the sink that no longer drips. The jar on the counter at Whitfield Repair is still there, still full of torn receipt paper and names of people who owe him something he'll probably never collect. But there's a new slip in it now, folded the same way as all the others. It just says Terrence one Saturday, no favors owed, in his own handwriting, dated the week after his own faucet finally stopped dripping. He didn't do it to prove anything to Denise, or Jordan, or the ghost of a 6-year-old boy watching his father lose everything in a single afternoon. He did it because he finally understood something Otis never got the chance to learn, that a man can be worth keeping even on the days he isn't fixing anything for anyone. Terrence isn't the only man on his block carrying a version of this story, and he isn't the only one who never noticed it happening. Plenty of black men his age grew up watching fathers, uncles, and neighbors survive collapsing industries by becoming indispensable, And plenty of those sons picked up the same tool without ever being handed instructions. Some of them are still fixing everybody's transmission except their own health. Some of them, like Terrence, are just now starting to put their own name on the list. Some Black Gen X men spent their whole lives believing that choosing themselves was a betrayal of everyone who raised them. Terrence Whitfield is still learning, slowly and imperfectly, that it's actually the opposite. The people who love you were never asking you to disappear for them. They were just waiting for you to believe you were allowed to stay. If you know a man exactly like Terrence, or if you've spent years being him, there's another video linked above about what happens to the men who never learned how to rest.